Hello, everyone. Welcome to our second Bioconvergence Building a Leading Bioscience Ecosystem in LA webinar series. I'm Mark Wisniewski, Senior Director, Biopharmaceuticals at UCLA Technology Development Group. And in the essence of time, because we have a robust presentation and really a great group of panelists today, I'm going to turn it over immediately to Dr. Judy Gasson, Professor Emerita and Senior Advisor to UCLA David Geffen School of Medicine for Research and Innovation.
Thank you, Mark. And it's my great pleasure today to introduce our moderator, Rajit Malhotra. He has 25 years of experience as an entrepreneur, investor, and consultant. He's been a highly successful serial entrepreneur, the managing partner for McKinsey in Southern California, and is currently the co-founder and executive chairman of Dyve Biosciences. He also serves on a number of boards, including the UCLA Technology Development Corporation. Rajit?
Judy, thank you very much. And morning, everybody. It's nice to see all these familiar faces, and to everybody in the audience. For those of you who joined us last time, welcome back. For those of you who are joining us today, thank you. Well, I'm super excited to continue our conversation we started last time. But before I do that, let me do a quick round of introductions to the panelists before I turn it over to Christian. So we have Ilde from City of Hope, Jessica from Amgen, Hallie from Alexandria Real Estate, and Robert from the CHDI Foundation. Thank you all for making the time. Oh, Dave Whelan, how can I forget? Thank you all for making the time once again to join us today. And then, of course, Christian, who's graciously committed a second session for us. Christian, some of you heard last time, is the founding partner of Catenion, which is a boutique strategy consulting firm based in Berlin. He has done a tremendous amount of work around biopharma innovation and clusters, and has actually taken a very science-driven approach into developing his insights. He's worked extensively around what it takes to create a sustainable biotech industry, including working with universities on promoting translational research and working with the public sector on the same topic. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Christian for his presentation, and then we'll come back and engage our panelists.
Okay, thanks very much for the kind introduction, and good morning, everybody. I'm delighted to be here for the second time. What I would like to do in the next half hour is give you a very brief summary of the first session for those who weren't around or have forgotten. And then I would like to develop a narrative for what's next in terms of biomedical innovation, and finally focus on a few practical thoughts for the panelists to take up and discuss on how to build a leading biomedical innovation hub in LA. So my last slide from the first session basically had three messages: innovation clusters emerge and fade, and that's true both in the sciences and the arts. And that means Boston will not last forever. The economic model of biopharma innovation has reached its limits. And for LA to emerge, copying Boston does not look like a good strategy. What we need is a different narrative. And in terms of building towards that narrative, I discussed where we are coming from and where we are currently standing in terms of our innovation system. And I used the S-curve, the humble S-curve, to describe two very different systems. The first one I called the chemistry system, lasting from around 1930 to the late 1970s, where essentially we did phenotypic screening for heterogeneous populations and small molecules. And the people and the organizations driving this were pharma subsidiaries of chemistry giants, and a lot of direct collaboration between pharma and academia, and it was an environment of low prices. And then since 1980, roughly, we have moved slowly and then increasingly rapidly on the S-curve to a system where, in terms of science and technology, we do targeted screening, multi-targeted approaches, patient population stratification, novel modalities. So the impact on the disease burden, which we measure here, conceptually on the y-axis has really become quite exceptional. And in terms of the financial and organizational ecosystem, we have moved away from the organizations that we saw to VC-funded biotech, big pharma, and rapidly escalating price levels underlying the whole. So I made 2 points here. The first one was these systems are fundamentally different from each other, and they arise both in terms of progress on science and technology, but also in terms of policy making. And the other point is the spirit of the times, as Georges Ballard called this in his essay on innovation, has also fundamentally changed. And I introduced, or I took Jonas Salk as an epitome for the chemistry system, and we can take perhaps Pfizer as one for the current system where dollars really, money makes the world go round. Okay, so let me try and project this into the future, and you will appreciate that this is just one way to look at the future. I don't have a glass ball, but this is what I see. And there are different narratives, of course, for this next system. Some people say regenerative medicine, it's already here. It's fundamentally different from small molecules, monoclonal antibodies, the classic biopharma business. Big data, artificial intelligence, machine learning is another way of basically prism to look at the systems change. Then we have somebody like Elon Musk who basically says, you know, I think the solution to many diseases is just a software problem. I wish it was true. And others who look at biology in transition from an empirical science driven by serendipity to an engineering discipline. So I've looked at all of these and I find them true to some extent, but I find them falling a bit short in terms of characterizing a truly different system that is different in the sense of the difference between the first two. And what I've come across when I was doing my reading and my interviews is the concept of bioconvergence, which I think offers a potential for a broader narrative. So what is bioconvergence? Like all good ideas, this one has been around for quite some time. I've seen it first emerge in an MIT report published in 2011, and then followed by another one in 2016. And the whole idea here is basically to say, we have so many new technologies now, and they have emerged at the same time, they are emerging at the same time, that they have the fundamental capability of changing the way that we do innovation. And basically, these new platform technologies that we all are familiar with in biopharma, gene therapy, cell-based therapies, nanotechnology, the microbiome, bioelectronics, material science, these were all things that had very, very limited impact in the past, and that's changing fast, and moving the innovation system to an approach that is a co-innovation approach based on biological, mechanistic, electrophysiological understanding across biological layers. And of course, trying to cut populations into smaller and smaller homogeneous groups, and ideally looking after individual patients. Now, DARPA, like very often, picked this up earlier than most. They launched a Biological Technologies Office, which is very much in the spirit of what we're talking about. And I'm glad to report that the Israeli government adopted bioconvergence as the next growth driver of the country earlier this year. So this is the scientific and technology side. Now let me quickly look at the ecosystem. And, you know, I look at this, and this is perhaps an old Europe perspective. You can discuss this. I'm curious to hear your views. I think the potential trigger that we need is policymakers to realize that we need to save capitalism from itself. I'm not the first who says that. You're sitting in flames, surrounded by flames. The financial system is questionable in terms of its sustainability. And we see in all Western countries the social contract and democracy in danger. And I think the fundamental point here is that we need to continue to guarantee access to education and healthcare. I've told you last time that in my view, the discussions that focus uniquely on drug pricing and reimbursement are falling far short of what we need. We need a much more integrated view of looking at the system and how to change it. And my personal view is that the economics can only change and the prices come down if we change the way of financing translational research for sustainable information. I want to talk a little bit about, in this presentation, about the financing mechanisms and the characteristic innovation vehicles, which I can see in the future. This is not for tomorrow afternoon. This will take longer. The S-curve evolves over 30, 40 years. But I think we will see more public financing through grants of translational research, taking a part at least of the space that is now occupied by VC money. We will also see a larger role for academia and mid-sized, lower profit companies, side entrants and other industry players moving into the space that today belongs exclusively to biopharma. And in terms of regulation, pricing, reimbursement, I think in the US, sooner or later, you will have to move to full reimbursement and controlled price levels just to ensure that this message here is implemented. All right, so this is a historical view in a way, and when I developed this, my Israeli friend said to me, well, why are you always talking about pharma? We are not interested in pharma, we are interested in the medical innovation system. And I realized that this really is in danger of being an inside-out view. And in order to capture the full potential significance of this concept of bioconvergence, we need to change perspective. And in this changed perspective, biopharma, which today from inside what I call the Boston bubble, is the natural value generator and the natural place and industry to capture value, the dominant player that everybody else is servicing with samples, with data, with algorithms, with technologies and diagnostics, that this may be changing in the future under this new paradigm. And in fact, I would propose to you that biopharma very likely is going to be just one of several industry players that need to co-innovate, that need their capabilities to co-innovate. And where bioconvergence today is a very small overlap between these four industries, it will likely increase. And behind this, behind these four industries, we have, of course, a large number of different disciplines that need to come together, and that starts in academia and is then continued in industry to bring innovation forward. And there are a number of hurdles that have been variously mentioned in the literature that need to be addressed. It starts in academia and facilitating collaboration across disciplines. It continues with the grant agencies, and also with the way that publishing companies decide where and how to publish. Everything that's transdisciplinary always has a hard stand at the beginning. So inside each of these four boxes or four different industries, we already have players that are positioning themselves or are well positioned to become players in this bioconvergence environment in the 2030 plus year frame. I want to very briefly mention Fresenius as one company in the biopharma space, very briefly GSK and Astellas, big data's, Apple, Verily, and the healthcare providers I have no time to talk about, but look up Sheba Hospital in Tel Aviv, Tel HaShomer it's called also, that is in the process of positioning itself as a leading innovation hub. We also have low margin, tech savvy side entrants like Fujifilm, Japan Synthetic Rubber, Samsung, and many more that see an opportunity here to use their capabilities in manufacturing, CMC, and technology to move into the healthcare and innovation space. And the final message here on this slide is that since we have convergence across different industries, that also likely implies that price levels will be converging and converging from pharma, seen from pharma, likely downwards. We can discuss that later if you want. So I wanted to very briefly show a few interesting examples of collaboration between academia and established companies. One is Fresenius Medical Care and the Italian University in Torino. One is Japan Synthetic Rubber and the third ranked university in Japan, Keio. And then GSK with UCSF Berkeley and GSK and Verily in the field of bioelectronics. And the common elements here are long-term commitment of the partners, active project and IP management by the established company, and ample room for academic publications. So these show, I think all of them show that it is possible to bring these different worlds together and to respect the constraints of both of them. Very briefly about Fresenius Medical Care. This is a company in the dialysis space. They produce their own dialysers and diagnostics for them. They have the clinics, they run the clinics in which patients are being dialyzed. They have a renal research institute with big data, machine learning capabilities, and they have built over the last 15 years with the University of Torino, basically a regenerative medicine-driven biotech. And what's interesting about this, the whole thing is characterized by a tight professional management of projects, IP, publications, and infrastructure that has worked both for the leading professor in terms of establishing him in a leading position in key domains. This is exosome-based therapies, and for the company, a leading position in IP. Japan Synthetic Rubber is a materials science company that is now in its third changing evolution step. They hooked up with Keio University, built an innovation center behind the university hospital, where they are focusing on precision medicine, microbiome, cell-based medicine, and medical devices. This has been very much positioned as at least 10 to 20 year collaboration with a view to realizing commercialization in the end. GSK, 2 years ago, I think, entered into a collaboration with UCSF and Berkeley, establishing a laboratory for genomic research. What's interesting about this is not so much the money that GSK is putting in, but that there are employees from both sides. This is collaborative, and they've designed this in a way that the scientists can publish with minimal restrictions. Licenses for targets discovered go to GSK. The AI support comes from GSK, and whatever tools are being developed in this collaboration are to be made freely accessible to scientists. You can see this is a slightly different flavor from the classic collaborations between big pharma and universities that we've seen over the last 20, 30 years. And then finally, and just to pick up on one of the emerging fields that will be potentially directly competing with chemical approaches to dealing with pathophysiology, bioelectronics. So GSK signed a few years ago a $700 million collaboration with Verily. And Astellas, the Japanese company, just purchased a company that produces neural dust, as it's called, which are small implantable devices to stimulate nerves through electrical signals. With the time that I have, this is the little flavor that I wanted to give you by what I mean when I talk about bioconvergence. And now I would like to turn to a few more practical thoughts, how these can be translated into building an innovation hub or cluster in Los Angeles, or building it up. Now, on the left-hand side, you see what everybody is talking about, which is essentially placing safe bets on the second S-curve in which we are currently living. And that needs to be done, but it's unlikely to help build a leading position for the future because it's not really differentiating. And what fits into this box, we've discussed some of this in the first session: attract more VCs, attract more pharmas, CROs, and build on the regenerative medicine CMC base that is being established in Los Angeles. So I don't want to discuss this further. I don't want to diminish this and its importance at all, but I think the whole point of this lecture series here is to focus on the other side. And coming back to Georges Pallad's flowery imagery, tending the garden of the golden flower. So what needs to be done here? And I think there is an opportunity for Los Angeles to develop a long-term action plan around this bioconvergence narrative, experiment with new forms of professionally organizing and financing biomedical innovation. I will not suggest to go back to the 1950s. Don't worry about that. Offer choice of models to innovators, investors, and established companies so that they can choose the road that is available today through VC-funded biotech and financially driven collaborations, or go into a novel direction, which currently is almost not available. And that could be hopefully potentially differentiating. So I will make a few points around these 6 dimensions here. So the first one is the bioconvergence narrative, how to make use of that. The second one, and I think this is absolutely crucial, everybody talks about it, but I haven't seen it really happening in a way that I would like to see, removing barriers to innovation in academia. And there's an additional barrier to the ones that we have today in terms of cross-disciplinary collaboration. Design novel innovation vehicles, design novel grant-based financing mechanisms, and change the economics of the collaboration in the ecosystem. And then the final point is building a different spirit in parallel to the one that everybody is used to today, and potentially involving the population, as again we've learned from Georges Palade. This is a very powerful lever. So starting with the first point, the goal here would be to put LA on the map as the place to be or to go to for bioconvergence. And I think you have one asset, one of the very few ones in the world with Caltech, which you could build into a virtual laboratory. I would suggest that you look at the Flemish Institute of Biology, which is a virtual institute which has real bricks, but is basically spanning 4 Belgian universities and has been extremely successful with this. Broad provides another blueprint in Boston. Put special emphasis on bioconvergence and pick a few fields. Do a basic science and technology mapping. Where is the science strong in LA? Pick a few fields for initial funding, and then start to implement mechanisms to attract leading players from the outside, both companies and individuals. And I would just like to remind you that Stanford, there were 2 reasons why Stanford became really a leader in biochemistry, I think. One is the hospital moved from inner town, downtown San Francisco to Palo Alto. The other one is they brought in Arthur Kornberg from Washington University, who came with a whole group of leading scientists and attracted many, many more in the following decades. I also think that here what we need to talk about is building partnerships with bioconvergence, emerging bioconvergence players. And Israel and Korea are 2 that are moving in this direction very forcefully. Second point is removing the barriers to translation in academia. And I think on the left-hand side, the usual things. I would just like to point out that one of the problems or challenges with removing these barriers in academia is precisely the spirit or the ethos which in academia has, not really changed over the last 40 years. We now have TTOs and we have a small group, maybe 10%, maybe a few more of PIs who are interested in the commercial model, but most of them are not, and they do their research in a way that basically means it cannot be leveraged into innovation, which is a big shame and a big waste of resources. What I like about the Spark Stanford model, and it certainly has its limitations, but what I really like about it is it's driven by academics for academics. So this is not a TTO representative who comes to the professor and tries to coach him and cajole him into filing IP. This is basically academics helping their colleagues. And they are agnostic as to the profit motive. So if you want to make money and be coached by Spark Stanford, that's great. And if you want to work on the third world disease, that's great as well. So much for this point. I think the fundamental issue that we are having with the current system and its sustainability is the way that we finance innovation. And I would suggest that we need to think about setting up funding agencies that can substitute and maybe even do a better job than VCs with rigorous grant-based project selection and funding. And I would like just to make a few points here. I'm not envisaging one gigantic agency that everybody has to turn to, and if they say no, then there's no chance to get funding. I know from experience how difficult it is to evaluate projects and to get a proper perspective on the feasibility of stuff to work in real life. So I think we need multiple agencies. We need clear, transparent decision criteria, independent decision makers, independent from the institutions that will receive these funds. We could probably start with donations rather than waiting until the US government starts setting aside significant amounts of money. And I would just drive this idea of staying very professional in the way innovation is managed, even if we change the funding mechanism, and set up a decision analysis group that can help mapping technologies and do due diligence quality project evaluations before money is allocated. In terms of the economics, very quickly, back of the envelope calculation, I'm happy to elaborate. With a $5 billion grant volume, you can roughly buy 10 clinical proofs of concepts. And in return, I think you would ask the pharmaceutical and other players that partner with transitional research from academia in return for lower risk or de-risked projects to accept reasonable pricing. And I just take here the average EU price level for oncology drugs, which is about half of what it is in the US. The next point is who gets this money and who does the innovation, the translational research? And I have been enough around in academia to know that you can't give the money to a university. It needs to be separate. It needs to be organizationally separate. And I would think that the idea here could be to set up something that mirrors the for-profit biotech with a not-for-profit acatech that works on similar principles, but is grant funded. It doesn't have to turn a profit and allows PIs to make a choice and say, you know, maybe I'm more comfortable working on my project with a large pharma or a side entrant company without having VCs breathing down my neck. I'm just interested in bringing innovation into the clinic. And you leave the choice to the people. That's basically it. The value proposition is to offer choice. You pay these people competitive salaries, and you would manage these vehicles that are funded by grants with experienced biomedical executives. There are enough of them around by now that have enough money in the bank that they can work for a reasonable salary and don't need an upside of millions of dollars. And young professionals who want to cut their first teeth. We don't have too many of these things around, but if you look at DINDI, Drugs for Neglected Disease Initiative, that was set up by Médecins Sans Frontières with the money that they got from the Nobel Prize. They have developed now 7 drugs. I think what is interesting here is they reckon, based on their track record, that they can develop new chemical entities, including attrition, for something like 60 to 190 million. They work obviously by strong arming established players into giving them very, very low prices for the services which they get their experiments done at. But it gives me some confidence that my back of the envelope calculation is not entirely off. I think one of the key issues, again, is to reduce the risk for established players. And you do that by financing, grant financing, translational research in collaboration with such companies, and thereby lowering the risk and lowering also the need for, therefore, compensating risk through high prices. And then finally, what we need to do is building an ecosystem that dispenses recognition to players as well as active supporters that goes beyond just money. And I think we can learn a lot by looking at Bell Labs. That was a while ago, but you know, people who worked at Bell Labs were absolutely top, and they didn't do it for the money. They signed away their IP rights for a $1 note, I've been reading. DARPA, look at people who go and work for DARPA for 3 or 4 years. They get paid well, but there's no upside in their endeavors. They do this because it's kudos that you get out of working for DARPA and on projects that are important for the nation. And my final point, again, for the panel to discuss whether I'm completely wrong and out of insane, maybe, to think about raising some sort of support from the citizenry, because it seems to me that every citizen has a personal interest in healthcare. And if we change the way that we recognize the success in healthcare, then this is something that we can potentially leverage. So I'm coming to the end. I have 2 more slides. The first one is to say that I think LA is large enough to become a pioneer for the 3rd S-curve. And I've just tried to compare LA County here in terms of square miles or square kilometers and inhabitants with Israel. Israel is, of course, mostly desert. And if you are not careful, that may be true for Los Angeles County in a while as well. It's the largest non-state level government entity in the US. And so you have a base here. And I think you have a base to become a pioneer with a different narrative and to lead a national conversation about what needs to change to make the current system sustainable and to evolve it to the next stage. But ultimately, I also realized that the success will rely on national policymaking. And it will rely on a different ethos and establishing a level playing field in terms of economic incentives that goes well beyond what you can do at the level of LA County. I think my whole view here is to try, experiment, show that different vehicles and funding mechanisms can work as well as the current model that we have. And finally, based on novel communication technologies and COVID, I think the emerging system will be much more distributed than the previous ones. The first one was clearly dominated by Germany and Switzerland, the current one, the US. And we have for the next S-curve and narrative here, Israel and Korea currently in the lead in terms of science and technology and policy making, driving this bioconvergence narrative. And I see also a potential advantage to the EU and Japan in terms of spirit of the times. We've paid a huge price on the second S-curve for not going as far in deregulating and making money king as the US, but it can turn into a potential advantage if I'm not completely mistaken. So I would like to stop here and hand it over to Rajit and the panel. Thank you.
Christian, thank you once again for an incredible wealth of insight, but also just as importantly, your confidence in LA and the terrific straw man that you've laid out for us with the hypothesis that perhaps bioconvergence is part of the narrative and the answer for LA. So let me and you make an extremely strong argument for why that might be the best candidate. But before we dive deeper there, I'd love to ask the panel the question on what do you think is the innovative breakthrough that'll drive the next S-curve, right? And is it, what's your level of confidence that it would be bioconvergence as opposed to big data or regenerative medicine or or other technologies and platforms that we haven't discussed right in the last half hour? And maybe Dave, maybe I'll start with you because you sit at the epicenter of all of these issues, but would love your perspectives.
Yeah, great. And first of all, I think Christian's talk today really feeds into a lot of the story that what led to the development of BioscienceLA and how we're trying to pull together all of these resources here in the LA region. And I think to your question, Rajit, this idea of bioconvergence and sort of let's think about what are the various things that are converging there, and ultimately to me, that really is the LA story, where we're able to pull in the bio and the digital and sort of new emerging technologies and even new emerging ways to communicate about it. So in a sense, I would say for LA, and certainly for how I look at this, it's really about how do we start with this idea of the intersection of these technologies and methodologies, and how do we leave enough sort of creativity and flexibility in there to bring in other, other technologies as needed. Because frankly, if we think we know the answers today, in 1 year and 5 years, we're going to be talking about some new technology that isn't even on the presentation yet. And that's maybe where the S-curve is. So that's kind of my starting thoughts.
Thanks, Dave. So if we, I think Kristen also makes, by the way, I'm seeing questions come through. So to the participants, feel free to lob your question in the Q&A box here, and I'll try my best to incorporate them as we go through the next 45 minutes or so. So Kristen, you made the point that Boston's not going to last forever. I think there is we are on what it appears to be the cusp of a new S-curve. LA needs a new narrative, and you make an extremely strong argument that bioconvergence could very well be a large component of this solution for LA. So I guess I'd love to spend a little bit of time on, do we have the pieces in LA to take advantage of a bioconvergence driven S-curve acceleration? And feel free to chime in, panelists.
This is Jessica. I'll pitch in first. I actually think LA has an incredible lead compared to other cities for bioconvergence. We already have a very diverse industry, group of different industries here in LA. There's not just one dominating or two dominating industries. And even if currently they're not right now specifically, in the drug development era, because of all of the technology and engineering and all of the different attributes that are now, as Christian said, coming together to create more of a holistic, treatment paradigm for patients moving forward, and price dynamics, et cetera, those skills can be actually translated and brought into this whole larger bioconvergent industry. And I think that's LA's, that's where LA actually has a cut above a lot of the other cities. We are, in the past, we have had what has somewhat worked against us is the geography. We're very spread out, they're very different locations, et cetera. I'm optimistic actually that in this new part of the curve, being in a dense pocket is actually not necessary. You are going to need people working together physically in certain areas on certain topics, but having kind of a being able to have that dynamic sense, same time zone, yes, you can get across the city depending on the rush hour within an hour or 20 minutes, whichever it is, but it's not as necessary as it used to be. And so I actually think, and I think, speaking to the choir here, LA is filled with people who want to reinvent themselves. It's still an entrepreneur city. It's not a city that's just resting on its laurels. People are coming to LA to establish themselves and try new things. And I think that spirit leads well for us as well.
Yeah, and maybe just to add to that, Christian, I think you brought up some great points, particularly as it relates to physical sciences, which I think sometimes the importance of physical sciences in moving life science forward is kind of this obvious but ignored intersection. And that's also an area where Greater LA has historically been extremely strong, both Caltech and UCLA. For an exercise this year, I went through the emerging biotechs over the last 10 years of both the universities, and over a third have been physical science companies. And so, I think it's at the university university level, continuing to push this research, whether it's, photonics, LiDAR, this kind of deep tech, so not necessarily software, but, kind of hands-on physical sciences, and figuring out where those converge, that we can really kind of push forward some really interesting new areas in biopharma. And along those lines, I think we also want to distinguish ourselves from San Francisco. Boston is a leader, but San Francisco is also a leader in how AI and life science, intersect. And so I think there's a lot of room for LA to put a stamp on kind of these new ways that technology can intersect, and that we can, figure out new ways, whether it's to develop treatments or models around how people get treated better.
Thank you, Hallie. I'd love, Jessica touched on this as well, but this notion of geographic proximity. I mean, from an Alexandria real estate perspective, I mean, what are your thoughts on, the importance of actually having these hubs where people can congregate and understanding COVID and all of the, the value of sort of virtual interactions, but where do you stand on this?
Yeah, so there's a lot of different models out there in terms of how clusters have evolved and been successful. And I actually think, when we talk about San Francisco, for instance, it is also very spread out, right? Like if you want to go to Palo Alto to East Bay, like block off your day. So I don't think we're the only ecosystem that has to manage, those challenges. So the way that we think about it is the subnodes or the subclusters really driving innovation within LA. So where we have West LA and its proximity to UCLA, to Silicon Beach, where we have Caltech, Pasadena, the San Gabriel Valley, with City of Hope nearby, and then out in Thousand Oaks with Amgen and this incredible talent pool, both on the executive scientific level and then kind of emerging in terms of new companies. So we try to break it down into, kind of specific areas. And then over time, those continue to interact. We can still think of that as one overall LA ecosystem.
Thanks, Hallie. And as you were speaking, it reminds me, it's not just creating the forums for interaction, whether they're virtual or physical, but there's also, what are, and this is related to the question that just came in. How do we precipitate this collaboration that's necessary amongst all of the stakeholders in the system, right? Is there a single conductor, right? That's helping do it. Is it more organic, right? Is there a responsibility for, many of the institutions that are represented on the panel, but many others even outside, for them to step up and play this role? And I'd love to hear, Robert, your perspectives. I think you're on mute, Robert.
Doesn't say I'm muted. Can you hear me now?
There you go. We can.
Okay, sorry about that. No, I was going to volunteer for the job. So if we need an orchestrator, I'm there for you, man. No, all kidding aside, I think, in the same way they say that hunger is the best seasoning, need is the best orchestrator. There are some needs that maybe were slightly less well anticipated, as evidenced by this COVID pandemic, and other needs that are very clearly before us. With the demographers love to make fun of us because there are some things that are very predictable. We're going to be having an aging population with an increasing incidence of neurodegenerative diseases, and those are the kinds of things that you can predict. And there's a huge opportunity for LA to differentiate itself. I think the notion of our geography is something that on the one hand, as people have correctly pointed out, now that we're all getting used to working virtually, is maybe less of an encumbrance or an inhibitor than it's been in the past. But there's still, things about Los Angeles, actually good things about Los Angeles that, present themselves as, I think, unique opportunities. We talked about this a little bit last time, with the emergence of Korea as a player in this space, and our relative geographic proximity, the same way the East Coasters probably feel a slightly higher affinity to European partners, is something that I think LA can really leverage. And while we're spread out, LA, undoubtedly represents a huge population cluster. As somebody who works on rare and neglected diseases, that's important. If you've got a disease that's 1 in 10,000 and you're out in the middle of nowhere, being able to do not just interventional clinical trials, but even more experimental medicine types of things where you need to do longitudinal studies and see people, time and time again, you can certainly get people to the very high quality types of research institutions here with City of Hope, with UCLA, with USC, to be able to conduct those studies in very credible ways. So I think that there is an opportunity, certainly for charismatic leadership to play a role in catalyzing what happens here in LA. But I think there's also a lot going on organically that could very well precipitate a very positive trajectory for LA in the near future.
I would like to add to Robert's comments and to following up on what Christian said, about, how should we tell our narrative? And I think by the fact that we are here all together discussing, what we value above all the monetary remuneration is this kind of societal community impact that we can have. That's why we're talking about, creating this new innovation hub in Southern California. And so I think this is the opportunity for us, to tell the narrative one way where we're really facing it toward the community. I mean, that's the legacy of City of Hope, right? What we're trying to build upon is that, patients who have gotten care there, they are returning, they are referring everyone. And, we're now building this new model of innovation where we're partnering very, very closely with all the investigators to really help not just drive the science toward great academic publications and additional grant funding, but really, bringing it faster and closer to the patients. So we have this opportunity, all of us together, to form this new narrative, find ways to work together, to really impact the community around us.
Thank you, Robert and Elze for your comments as well. I guess, I look at this and feel like we have lots to celebrate about, many of the institutions in LA are doing very unique, very innovative things. The question I have is, are we all rowing in the same direction, right? Is there an overarching approach and alignment on where we're headed? And how does that occur? Do we need, a Broad or a Rockefeller or a champion, right? Robert, you mentioned this as well. Do we need somebody to really take up the mantle and align all of these various initiatives into a common purpose?
Yeah, I'll take a shot at that, and I think in some ways we have some of those champions already, and some of those are in successful companies, whether they're long-standing companies like Amgen or newer ones like Kite or Nant, and obviously Patrick Soon-Shiong, who sort of brings together the mix of innovation in life sciences, but now, honestly, media and entertainment through sports. And so in some ways, he's really connecting some of these dots that make LA unique. We have these large personalities who are helping to drive innovation. But I think what really makes LA special is sort of all of these connections of other individuals, each of whom are kind of telling their own stories, that narrative that Ildiko mentioned. And part of this is how do we help foster growth of some of those stories? How do we help turn small stories into bigger stories? And so I think here in LA, maybe unlike some of these other hubs, it's about the collective consciousness, the collective growth that really starts to pull things together. And that's what we're trying to make happen with BioscienceLA. That's what, as I look across this group here of the companies or organizations we have represented, from medical innovation to both real estate and investment to biopharma and everything in between. How do we kind of connect those in a way that we're creating kind of this story that's bigger than any one person?
Rajit, can I ask the panel a question?
Yes, of course, Christian.
So I think all of these points that were made are really excellent, but you focused all very much on the technology side and on the geography and the questions that everybody's dealing with anyway. I would be really interested in your views on whether, as I think, there's a lot of unleveraged potential for translation in academia that we can only get to if we offer an alternative model to PIs. And the other point that I would like to really curious to hear your reactions is whether you think that it is realistic that established companies, in exchange for grant-based de-risking of early stage clinical research, will be agreeing to charging lower prices than they could if they went through the VC channel.
So happy to take particularly that first question in terms of innovative models, and also just to kind of shine a light on UCLA. I think there's three really impressive models that are ongoing in terms of how to help translate companies or science to a greater level that aren't necessarily VC. First, CERM with the $5.5 billion bond measure that was just passed, which really speaks to kind of how to push funding in a different way. And I think there's conversation to be had why it only passed by 51%. But I think we should all be really excited that that's going to continue to help fund companies. The second is UCLA's partnership with Audubon, which was recently announced, which is a really creative early VC model where they can help kind of lead PIs in the right direction in terms of the questions to ask, also provide support on the CRO side to get them to the right stage of funding, where someone like Alexandria Venture Investments would come in. And then I think the third, and this is again to the TDG's foresight, is their internal funds, where they can provide $200,000 grants at the right stage for a PI to bridge to that next level. So I think those are three ways that are very, kind of prescient here in LA. Caltech has the Rothenberg initiative, which is similar. Have that, the greater ability we'll have to both spin out those companies and provide an ecosystem where they can stay here instead of having to look elsewhere for that support. And I'll let someone else take the question on pricing models.
I'm going to add just one thing on your piece, Hallie, and I'm not going to touch pricing, but as well. But I think those are really great examples. In particular, I think the Audubon is a really, really interesting model that I know they're looking at additional institutions to connect with, maybe even some in SoCal, and that would be terrific as kind of a new proof of concept. What we don't yet have is something that pulls together disparate organizations. And how do we sort of connect the academic institutions and the medical centers, research going on there, and some of the independent organizations here. And so I think that's something that I look to us to strive to do over the coming years, is how do we sort of connect some of those organizations in a way where, one, we can attract additional funding, maybe even from the untapped philanthropic or sort of family office dollars here in LA, and start to build something bigger than any one institution.
Yes. Yeah, if I can, pick up on that, and actually give a shout out to UCLA's technology development group. I mean, I think in large part, what they've done internally is to think about not just teeing up opportunities as a traditional tech transfer office, but how to really mature them and make them ripe for the types of translational work that are necessary. And I've seen this manifested in a bunch of very elegant ways, connecting two investigators internally for a drug device combination, thinking about reaching out to a contract research organization for a particular piece of the program that's missing, but would be on the critical path during due diligence. Really helping, I'll say this with all deference, egomaniacal principal investigators, to help them differentiate between what's pre-competitive and competitive, to know when it's okay to share and when it's okay, to patent. And I think, that's a big part in catalyzing, I think, what we're looking for, which is not just, a list, a laundry list for somebody to sort through. I mean, if you don't have that, then you've got nothing. But to then mature that list in a way that it really sets it up for success and sets it up for uptake by investors, by partners. And as a guy from a not-for-profit, I know that I'm well positioned to address your question about money, other than to say, I think that people are disproportionately worried about it too early on in the process. You've got a lotto ticket. And I think that, worrying too much about the downstream upside before something is really taken shape and you have a sense of what the probability of technical success is something that people should probably be a little bit more nimble and cautious about.
Thanks, Robert. Jessica, I'm going to turn to you because it looks like your fellow panelists have all successfully dodged the pricing question and left it for you. So
leave the pricing question to the big pharma. No, so I will do my part in dodging it as well. It is a bigger subject matter, and it is definitely out of my area of core expertise. But I would just say that the pricing discussion is far more complicated, which is a non-answer, obviously. But there are definitely ways to control pricing and bring it down that actually have to do with more on the later stage part of rebates, and middleman, et cetera. So, but in terms of the impact on potential prices with early innovation and early funding, I honestly don't know how that could actually impact future prices. I do know that prices need to come down for the end user, absolutely. But there is a need for some type of funding and constructive funding that allows the translation from the academic sites and the very early before it generally ends up fully in one of the big pharmas. And some of that sometimes happens with pharmas taking an equity stake in some of these very young companies. The VCs, as Christian mentioned, are the current go-to for several of them. It does lead to a very hot market in terms of prices for, buying and licensing some of these opportunities. And the prices for licensing them are going just incredibly high, and the risk of the opportunity still remains quite high, and even though the prices for the opportunity are going up. So there is something that needs to be done where there's a general funding source that can kind of bring down that astronomical price. It's also, and again, I'm not an economist, this is not my area of expertise, but it's disheartening and somewhat to see so many of these very young and early companies go IPO, right? Before anyone really understands the science of the product, and the public doesn't understand the science of the product either. So something I think has to change in that economical path, so to more appropriately de-risk and fund these opportunities early on.
Yeah, I just want to make clear, I'm not here to advocate unilateral price cuts in the US. I think I'm too much embedded into the innovation system to know that would be completely stupid. And unfortunately, the current debate in Congress is going in the wrong direction. I would like to link this, and I think you should think about, excuse me for saying it this way, but I think there's an opportunity to think about linking this pricing question to the way that we fund innovation, and especially at the translational stage. And in my view, putting on my economist's hat, the prices are rising because the risk is immense, right? And Robert made this point. We need to de-risk the stuff that established companies take on for late stage development, because only if we de-risk it will the prices come down. That's my point. And de-risking it implies that you need to take somehow the profit motive out of the earlier stages as a choice or an alternative to the system that we're having currently. And I'm just gently nudging you to whether you want to build, or your discussion just around the science and technology and different disciplines coming together and so on, or whether you think there might be an opportunity to experiment with other forms of financing and then also moving innovation forward.
It's a good push, Kristen, and actually also consistent with a few of the questions that have come in now around financing, right? Whether it's for profit or not for profit and grant based. I'd love I'd love the panelists' thoughts on how do we not just accelerate, but how do we grow the funding ecosystem, the availability of financing, but also the matching of opportunities to the right pools of money in the city, by a factor. And I'm one area that I'd love to come back to, this came up in our last session, was a lot of this is about storytelling, right? And I think, Dave, you'd made the point around we're sitting here in Hollywood, right? We're arguably the best storytellers in the world. How do we tell the story in a way that would help, would it help for us to tell the story in a way that would attract financing, right? Or are there other ways to make this happen?
I think, so it's interesting. We did an international conference a few years back in Nice, right before the Cannes Film Festival. And as a way of bringing together the thoughts of Huntington's disease, which is the disease that my foundation is exclusively focused on, and taking advantage of the timing of our location, we actually looked into how many times Huntington's disease has appeared in movies or TV shows. And it's like amazing how many times, from Marcus Welby, MD, to House, and everywhere in between. And I think that part of the reason why Huntington's disease was chosen is because it is such a horrific unmet medical need. But it makes the point that people do want to hear the story. People want to understand the nature of the unmet medical need, and also a bit about what it's going to take to go from where we are, to where we need to be in terms of affecting meaningful therapies for people. Just throwing money at the problem is unsatisfying. People want to know kind of where they are and what can be catalyzed by making an investment. Having a monogenic disease with 100% penetrance gives you a starting point to say, like, okay, I get it. That's a bad gene. I want to turn it off. If I give you money, are there technologies that will do that? And so, explaining and also explaining things to the broader public in ways that they can actually understand. For too long, I think that there was this sense that this whole drug discovery thing, it's just so complicated. Just let us take care of it. And I think that if there is a silver lining in COVID, I think there's a lot of people now that know what a virus is. I think there's a lot of people now that understand what an antigen is. I think a lot of people understand maybe even, what antibodies are. And I think that when they do that, it's a lot easier for some, not for all, sadly, to be able to make cogent decisions about, what they want to make investments in, for example. So I think leveraging Hollywood and being able to tell the story of drug discovery and unmet medical needs is something definitely could be an advantage for Los Angeles.
Yeah, just to add to that, Robert, which is very well said. I think, one of the important things, we're talking a lot about financial capital is one of these resources, but I think certainly here in LA, everywhere, but certainly in LA, we look at not just where capital is coming from, but where is the space to grow these companies to an Alexandria perspective, where is the talent to grow these companies, and how do we make sure we keep that talent in Los Angeles after they graduate, or how do we attract talent here? And so part of that storytelling narrative that Robert was just explaining so eloquently is sort of building on top of it. So all of us collectively need to be creating sort of almost a biological scaffolding, if you will, but how do we go from one stage to another? And you get early stage funding, which brings on early stage talent, which requires more space, which leads to additional capital and so on. And I think that's really one of the important things where collectively we can come together, is helping to understand how do we build each of those in, whether it's in lockstep or just build them in a way where we can be growing in a measured way. So to the point about, it's not about how quickly can you go IPO, it's about how measuredly can companies grow and technologies come out of that with the right level of assets there. And I think that's something where we've got some great resources in LA to make that happen.
Thank you, Dave and Robert. I want to switch gears a little bit to, we touched briefly on this both last time, but also today on our proximity to Asia. How is this an asset for LA? Are there, are we aware of examples of where this has proven to be an advantage, over Boston?
I think just from being a West Coast pharma company, in terms of the advantage, it's, obviously in terms of time zones, it's much easier to work with our Asian colleagues versus if we were over on the East Coast or in Europe. Beyond that, honestly, I think we've come to a global world. And so I don't think necessarily beyond that you actually have any advantage of being on the West Coast, except for the time zone. It's not like there's more cultural link or understanding. We're global now, pure and simple. And I think we need to be very competitive. If we want to maintain very close ties with our Asian colleagues and counterparts, we can't rest on the laurels that we're on the West Coast.
Oh, great. Well, I will, as I reflect on both the discussions, I find myself overwhelmed by the enormity of the problem and the opportunity, right? And it's just a big, thorny issue with multifaceted, and I think Christian likes to remind us there isn't necessarily a playbook, right, or anything that would guarantee success. So I guess I'd be curious as we go around the panel, right, as you think about what we've talked about for the last two sessions, what are the one or two things that you think are the most important first steps, right, towards establishing LA as a true hub, right? Where do we start?
I'm happy to, go ahead, Jessica.
Well, I was going to say, and we've spoken about it before, but if you really want to bring in the local infrastructure and gain people's interest to divert their funding and their finances and their time and their talent, et cetera, no better time is right now when science is so obviously impacting our lives. And it is, I think we are not doing a good job in Los Angeles and Ventura County, because I'll just suck in Ventura and the LA area, of really bringing in our public to understand science and have that communication and add that excitement to the local infrastructure and say all of the different aspects in terms of the technologies, the biology, all of that, we can use right now as a hook, and not in a bad way, to bring in the interest and then keep the ball rolling and show all of the industries that are here how much other opportunity there is in the space. And I haven't actually seen that from a local perspective occur yet.
I like what Jessica said, and to me, the two key things are, putting out a vision and pulling in the community around us into that alignment, and then showing some small wins, just that this works, and then that can accelerate things. Those two things.
And I'll just say, just to use it as an example for Amgen, obviously it's up in Thousand Oaks. We've spun off a couple companies that are local. We have, an exchange of scientists and other experts in the local area. But outside of our industry, very few people see that, right? And so we need to notch it up 5 different levels to gain other people's interest and have their attention turned towards it.
I think, it's cliche, but nothing succeeds like success. So probably like many of you, I've had a lot of really good ideas that didn't pan out. So we can have really good ideas for what LA might become. I think what's really important is as we take these initial shots on goal is to see what takes root and then build on it. What are the elements of what actually worked here? Because it brought together the right expertise, because it played to our geography, because it met with an emerging unmet medical need, because it was the right convergence of things that were needed and things that we had, and then pour gas on it and say, that works here. Let's do more of that. I mean, I don't necessarily subscribe to the lemming mentality you see in, it was a bit lost on me why Boston became the pharma hub for neurobiology. A couple of people decided we're going to do this here. And so a couple of people more said, well, if they're doing it, we're going to do it. But, there's also a very positive version of that says, when you got something that works, I want to do more of it. I also just want to, go back to the discussion on leadership and who's going to be the sort of, charismatic, leader for these efforts potentially. And I hope that a few emerge. I hope that it's somebody with a vision, but also somebody with a deep knowledge of how difficult drug discovery is. The Andy Grove or the Mike Milken or the Elon Musk who says, this is an engineering problem. We're going to reduce this to practice the way we've done other complicated things, I think is naive. And we really need somebody who is equally as visionary, but is well steeped in some of the very complex issues that surround drug discovery.
Hallie and Dave, would you like to chime in?
Sure, yeah. I was going to add 2 very practical things to focus on continuing to build the ecosystem. One is keeping companies here. And, given Alexandria's role in the real estate side, we have a job to do there. For a company to stay here and be successful, they need good lab space that fits their needs. So I think that's number 1, is keeping them in LA. And then number 2, and really speaking to the audience out there of PIs, of students, of those who are thinking about taking an idea and turning it into a company, is just to say, instill that entrepreneurial spirit, right? And there is support, and we are an early ecosystem, and so I think sometimes it's harder to, you know, create that early vision, to see other people do it. And so I just want to say, like, there is a path to do it. You know, everyone on this panel is, you know, one of those support levers. There's support in the ecosystem for you to be successful. And so, you know, if you're on that precipice of, do I spin out this company? Do I take that step? You know, I would just say, you know, take the leap. And we do have a community that's here to support you.
Great. Yeah, I think I echo everything that everyone's just said, but you know, add, you know, a couple of elements. You know, one is I think we do need to think very big, and if we are going to make a difference here, we need to be striving for something monumental, not you know, not small, but, you know, think very big, but then work incrementally to get there. So this is you know, as Robert said, you know, success begets more success, and you know, as the rest of us have said, let's start telling our successes early. And I do think it's important to get the rest of Los Angeles excited about what the way they are excited about entertainment, or the way they you know, might be excited about new aerospace or something like that. Let's get the rest of LA supporting the storytelling, so it's not just our insiders telling the story.
Thank you, Dave. I will. I know we're close to the end of our time. I will, for what it's worth, say I do think, you know, every revolution begins with a single discussion, and you know, hopefully we've you know, hopefully we've inspired at least the audience and the folks in this room to take some of this to heart as they go back to their daily lives. But Christian, thank you again for you know, the provocative materials and insights to and that we've been able to take advantage of, and to my panelists, thank you again for your time and you know, generous and generosity in terms of participating on this panel.
Yes, and I'd like to sincerely thank our panel and Christian for all your efforts with putting together the deck and your patience with us getting the panel organized. And as Rajit mentioned, you know, this is a marathon, and we're hoping that these type of discussions will continue to advance into actionable items that will showcase LA and drive LA to be the bioscience hub that it can be. So again, thank you everyone. Thanks to our audience for joining us today.